The U.S. versus Sean Diddy Combs is still bringing the drama halfway through his trial. The rap mogul is facing multiple charges, including racketeering conspiracy, allegations of sexual assault, and sex trafficking, which could land him in prison for life. This week, we heard from a friend of Cassie Ventura who claimed he dangled her off a balcony. Another woman came forward with more details of alleged drug-fueled freak-offs, or in her case, hotel nights. And the judge threatened to kick Diddy out of court. I'm Carlos Greer, senior reporter for Page Six, and like you, I've got questions. Joining me today is CNN entertainment correspondent, and if you're a fan of Page Six, you'll remember her as my co-host on Page Six TV, Elizabeth Wagmeister. And of course, entertainment lawyer, former litigator, and legal correspondent Lisa Bonner is back to connect the dots on what these testimonies mean for the prosecution's case. All right, so Elizabeth, I'm going to start with you because you've been on the case since day one. You haven't missed a day in court. You're there right now, as a matter of fact. Can you just give us a brief synopsis of what's been happening in the courtroom from week 1 to week 4? What stood out for you?
Yes, and I apologize that I am literally, talking to you right now from outside the courthouse in our cruise van. So if you see cars going by with the blurred background, that's what's happening. I'm literally on the scene. So look, from the start of this trial, as you know, Diddy's team, they have said that this is a case about his personal and private sex life. They said that you may think that some things are weird, but they're not criminal. They admitted from the offset that he is a violent man. They said that he's a domestic abuser, and that is absolutely indefensible. That is the word that his defense attorney used. But they said this is not a domestic violence case. So he shouldn't be found guilty. Now you go to the prosecution, and they have said the complete opposite. They've said that this is a man who has used his companies to operate a criminal organization, and that he is guilty of racketeering, sex trafficking, and transportation to engage in prostitution. Now, I say that because that's the overview, Carlos. And then what we've seen so far is the prosecution presenting their case. We are now on week 4. Of course, the prosecution's case will be longer than the defense's case. And they have brought on a series of witnesses, whether that is Cassie Ventura or the 2 women who are testifying under pseudonyms, Mia and Jane. They have all said that they were abused in different ways by Sean Combs. And then we've had witnesses who have come on to corroborate their accounts, whether that's to say, yes, I witnessed the violence of Cassie, or whether it's to say, I worked for Sean Combs and I was asked to get him drugs. I saw his bodyguards getting him drugs. People saw him being violent and they didn't do anything. So the prosecution is really painting this picture of everyone knew, and that Sean Combs was the ringleader, and as a very famous, powerful person, that everyone around him, whether it was an employee or whether it was a girlfriend, was scared and had to do what he wanted them to do.
What's happening in the courtroom today? The woman who's going by the pseudonym Jane, she took the stand yesterday and she's back in court this morning. What have you learned today, Elizabeth?
She is, and she's expected to be on the stand for up to a week. So that's a very substantial witness. If she is on for a week, that would be longer than Cassie Ventura's testimony. Now, I have to tell you, she's very emotional. She is quite literally sobbing on the stand. I mean, she is crying. At times she has to collect herself. The prosecutor has asked numerous times, Jane, do you need a break? She has said no, and she pulls through and keeps going. But she is a former girlfriend. So similar to Cassie, instead of Mia, who is a former employee, not a former romantic partner. And Jane has been telling the jury about her experience. She said she met Combs in 2020. They started dating in early 2021. And new information that we learned in her testimony is that she was dating Sean Combs up until the time of his arrest in September 2024. So this is a very, very recent relationship, probably one of the last relationships that Sean Combs was in before he was sent to jail. So you just imagine that he is facing the woman who, before he was arrested and brought to the MDC, that he was with in a relationship. So today, I want to zero in on one piece of information from her testimony that we have not heard before from any other witness in this trial. She has testified that Sean Combs allegedly used her as a drug mule of sorts. She said that on two different occasions that Sean Combs said, "Go to my house in Beverly Hills, pick up a package," and that package had drugs. She said that she went to the house and she said to Christina Coram, who is Diddy's chief of staff and very close personal assistant, she said, "Is this safe, to travel with drugs and to go on a plane with drugs?" And according to Jane, her testimony, she said that Christina Coram's response was, "I do it all the time. It's fine. Just throw it into your checked bag." So the reason why I bring this up, because there's so much testimony to get into, Carlos, we would need hours to talk about it.
Of course.
But this is a new allegation that Diddy not only was supplying drugs to romantic partners and was not only using his staff to help supply those drugs, but that he actually was using his girlfriend to bring him drugs over state lines on a plane. So that was new information today.
So Lisa, let me ask you this. Why are Jane's allegations key to the racketeering charges that he's facing?
Well, good afternoon, Carlos and Elizabeth. So Jane's testimony is very key for several reasons. One, the prosecution is trying to establish a pattern. And what they're talking about in Jane's instance is the instance of sex trafficking through coercion, keeping her compliant and keeping her in these freak-offs through drug-filled and drug-fueled nights at the hotel, if you will. And also, this goes, as Elizabeth said, to the drug trafficking portion of the RICO case, because under RICO, a predicate crime is the drug trafficking with the intent to distribute. So we've heard other people talk about that, was witnesses and procuring drugs as well. But Jane specifically talked about two instances. And the other tie-in from the RICO charge is that he is using his employees. She mentioned Christina Coram, and she also mentioned his security guard. So this goes to the RICO, but there are two other counts that are included in the indictment that specifically talk about victim number two, a separate count of sex trafficking and the transportation of prostitution across state lines. So sex trafficking is included in the RICO under the RICO crime, but this also goes to the two other counts of sex trafficking and the transportation of prostitution, which she basically stated, listen, I called, sometimes Sean called. In all instances, they flew in to meet us. Sean paid cash for this. So this is very important. Jane is a very important witness in establishing the pattern, because you don't want to go too much in terms of relying on, they needed somebody to rely on the fact that this was a pattern and not just a one-off bad relationship with his former girlfriend, Cassie, but also that this was a pattern. And so this is what Jane is doing. She is laying the predicate crimes out, and she is giving some explosive testimony.
Okay, so earlier this week, we also heard from Brianna Bagolin. She took the stand, and she's a friend of Cassie. And she claimed Diddy once dangled her off a 17th floor balcony of an apartment building, and that she saw him throw a knife at Cassie. Elizabeth, how did her testimony play out in court?
I am not going to lie, Carlos. This was some very rough testimony. Brianna Bongolan, as you said, her big allegation is that Sean Combs dangled her over the balcony at Cassie's home. Now, she also was brought on the stand to serve as a close friend of Cassie's who can corroborate Cassie's account. So from the prosecution's perspective, she's brought on not only to talk about this alleged horrific instance of violence where she's dangled nearly 20 stories in the air, thinks that she's going to lose her life, and she says that she still has night terrors over that alleged incident. But from the prosecution's standpoint, she's also there to say, yes, I saw these things that were happening with Cassie, and to add even another layer of credibility to Cassie's testimony, even though we've heard from so many witnesses who have all corroborated Cassie's testimony, or at least pieces of her testimony. But then on cross-examination, the defense was very effective, and the defense, they straight up asked her, are you lying? Are you making this up? You are not being truthful. And Brianna Bongolan, she had some trouble answering these questions. Many times she said, I don't remember. Now, you also have to remember, and Lisa could speak to this much better than me as an attorney, but testifying in a court of law is not a natural conversation. You are not allowed to just go back and forth and say what you want to say. You can only answer the question that is being asked of you. And most of the time, that can be a yes or a no. So when they ask her, on so-and-so date a few months ago, you spoke to the government and you said this, do you remember? And she just says, I don't remember. She's not necessarily saying that she doesn't remember that alleged incident happening. She's saying, I don't remember what I said on meeting 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5, or however many there were, with the government ahead of this, but in front of a jury, that can be a little risky. That can make it seem like this is not a solid witness. Now, the big bombshell that came out, at least from the defense's perspective, is Brianna Bongolan testified that this alleged balcony incident occurred on September 26, 2016. And they brought up hotel folios from Trump International Hotel here in New York City. It was actually a prosecution exhibit that they pulled up. So they took an exhibit from the prosecution and they used it right against them. And they said, this folio shows that Sean Combs, under an alias, was in New York City from September 24th through September 29th. And in a very snarky tone, his defense attorney, Nicole Westmoreland, said to Brianna Bongolan, you do understand that a person can't be in two places at once. So this was a big moment. This may have been the most effective cross-examination of the entire trial, but I do want to point out that on redirect, when the prosecutors came back up and they spoke to her, they said, do you have any doubt in your mind that Sean Combs dangled you over a balcony? And she said, no doubt at all, this happened. She did admit she may have not remembered the date correctly, but she said this 100% happened to me.
So, Lisa, what does all of this mean? So the consensus seems to be that, the defense had a good cross-examination. They kind of crushed this witness, if you will. But do you think it was a mistake to have her on? And how may that affect the credibility of the other testimonies we've heard?
Well, that's a very good question, Carlos. A lot of us lawyers were looking at trying to figure out what was the purpose of her testimony, because we had allegations of his violent behavior, of him beating Cassie allegedly, and all of the other violence that Brianna Bongolan was talking about and testifying to. The reason that she was brought on was specifically to talk about so-called mob behavior, right? The fact that he is allegedly dangling somebody from a 17-story balcony. So the one thing that I want to point out that I want to acknowledge that the defense did a very good job at undermining her. However, after that, the next witness that they brought on was a forensic expert that brought up a text message from Christina Karam's telephone, not Cassie, not Brianna's, but from Christina Karam's, that was seized by the feds, that had what we would call, contemporaneous conversation, where Cassie specifically said to Christina, what is going on here? I basically had I witnessed, this fight between Brianna and Diddy, and then he dangled her off of a balcony. And this was backdated. There was some discrepancies again with the date because of the fact that it was taken, and pulled up. But my point here is that I thought that was a very strong point that a lot of people aren't really talking about, because we are mentioning a lot of the fact that, yes, the testimony did seem sketchy, because Elizabeth said, you have to stick to the question that is asked, and you might not remember specific dates, but I do remember it happened. And then we come in and we have a text that was sent to Christina Karam, and Cassie was like, I can't deal with this. So that, in my opinion, in my legal opinion, did seem to back up what the prosecution was stating, that this is mob-like behavior that did happen. So that was the important tie-in that I thought was really important that we bring into this discussion.
Carlos, if I could chime in for a second, I just want to say that's an excellent point, Lisa. But also, as I sit there and I'm looking at the jury, and it's very hard to tell what they are thinking, I also wonder, you are hearing from so many witnesses over the course of so many years with this quite frankly, outrageous alleged conduct. One person is saying they're dangled off of a balcony. Another person is saying I was kidnapped at gunpoint and I was forced to go into a car where we were going to kill Kid Cudi. Another person says Sean Combs made me drive a car when he had 3 guns to go see Suge Knight. So you also wonder just the magnitude of what they are hearing. At a certain point, is the jury going to think, this isn't normal behavior? You're hearing all of these allegations. Is everyone lying? So it may help that they've heard these other alleged violent instances from other witnesses to say, this seems to be in his conduct of alleged behavior, and maybe Breonna really is telling the truth. And especially with that text that happened in real time from Cassie to Christina Karam to back it up.
Yeah. Well,
great point.
Yeah, and let's talk about the jurors, because this week Diddy got a stern warning from the judge. He threatened to exclude him from his own trial. So Wags, what happened there?
So this judge is very even-keeled. I have covered many high-profile trials. Every judge is very different. Some are dry, some are a bit more bombastic. This one, he has complete control over the courtroom, and he's very calm. So to see him get angry is not really something we have seen before. There have been times where he has reprimanded the defense, more so because of timeline, specifically with Cassie, that they were taking too long with her when they knew she had to get off the stand because she was going to give birth. But this was really the first time that we have heard Judge Subramanian come down hard in this courtroom. So he says to Mark Agnifilo, who is Diddy's lead defense attorney, he says, I saw your client on 2 different occasions during Breonna Bongolan's testimony looking at the jury and vigorously nodding. He said this is absolutely unacceptable. He is making attempts to interfere with the jury, which of course cannot happen. And he said, is this going to happen again? Mark Agnifilo said, no, Your Honor, it won't. And he said, essentially, it better not, because if it happens again, we will have to explain this to the jury, or your client can be excluded from the trial. And every defendant has the right to sit in a trial and face their accuser. So if Sean Combs wasn't there, that would be a big question mark for the jury. What happened? Why is he not there? Now, one point, though, that I do want to make, which is very, very important, and quite frankly, I feel like is being lost from some of the coverage, something that I have been pointing out on CNN from the second this happened, the jury was not in the room. The jury has no idea that this happened. So the jury has no idea that the judge reprimanded Sean Combs and that Sean Combs has not been following the conduct that you're supposed to follow in a courtroom. Remember, the jury is being instructed every single day. Do not watch the news. Do not read the news. Do not follow coverage. Do not look at TikTok. Now, whether or not they're listening to that, we don't know, but under the assumption that the jury is abiding by the judge's instructions to not follow coverage of this, they don't know. So this is a big deal in the context that he could be excluded. It's certainly a noteworthy moment for us to be talking about. But as of now, this really has no bearing on the trial because the jury has no idea that this happened.
Right. Well, but at least I am curious, why is that a mistake? Because you're looking at Diddy. I mean, after all, he is the person on trial here, and he's facing life in prison. Why is it a mistake for him to react? Why is this such a big deal that this happened? And do we really expect him to remain stoic?
Well, this is a big deal for the judge and the jurors because you want to avoid any impropriety with the jury, any kind of attempt to interact with the jury, because that's jury tampering. And so when he's nodding like, yeah, I told you so, yeah, that didn't happen. No, that is him trying to testify without testifying. So that is very important. And the judge was having none of it. But I think it was important that he stated it. And also, as Elizabeth said, it was outside of the jury. So he can, if this happens again, he can come in and give curative instructions. As a last resort, he would ban Diddy from the courtroom because of the fact that if Sean is found guilty, this will undoubtedly go up for appeal. And the last thing the judge wants is this overturned on a procedural error, that he overstepped his bounds. He interfered with the defendant's ability to get a fair trial by interacting with his lawyers in real time. And also, as Elizabeth said, every defendant has the right to face his accusers. So that would be the last thing, banning him from the courtroom. But what you don't want, and he said, you do not want to hear my curative instructions. So I think, from what I've seen today, and Elizabeth can obviously tell because she's in there, I think he's trying to toe the line when it would be smart to do so.
Yeah. Well, Elizabeth, what is Diddy's? You've been there every single day these past 4 weeks. What's his overall vibe in that courtroom? What's been his reaction overall? What have you noticed?
I have, and he's very engaged. He's very stoic at times, but he's very engaged in the sense that he is listening to this testimony. He is passing notes frequently, constantly to his defense, which means he's listening and he has ideas that he wants to share with his defense. And the only real emotion that we see from him is every morning when he walks in, he turns around and he faces the press and everyone else sitting there, including his family. And he often will do this. He'll send like a heart symbol to his mom or to his sons. He'll blow kisses to his mom in the morning. And again, he will turn around and look at the media. I saw him, I think it was the first week, maybe the second week, he scanned over and was looking in our direction. So when he walks in, he does look, again, sending nice gestures to his family, but during the trial, he's really engaged, not making much reaction. But I have to tell you, when the judge came down on him for nodding at the jury, I had seen him do this before. And I have also seen him nod in agreement, not facing the jury, which Lisa could clarify this. I believe that's allowed, but sometimes when he's listening to questions from his defense, he goes, this, but I have seen him look at the jury before, prior to yesterday, and nod at the jury. So this is not the first time that this has happened.
Right. Well, I mean, it is halfway to the finish line. It's the end of the 4th week. Lisa, from your legal perspective and just following the case for these past 4 weeks, how is the prosecution doing presenting their case and nailing down these charges?
From a legal perspective, I would say Diddy's goose is cooked. That's, they have a very high bar. Now, ultimately, it is up to the jury. I don't have a crystal ball to say what the jury is going to say. A lot is going to turn in on the closing arguments and the jury instructions. But you need only 2 acts of the predicate crimes of RICO. And if you look at it, the unrefuted evidence is bribery with the tape. You have also extortion that was proven by the CFO and alleged by Cassie's mother at the fact that they had returned, that Diddy had asked her, for $20,000 or he was going to release the tapes. So right there, that's 2X. And you also tied it to the enterprise with allegedly a lot of these crimes had been paid for, the money, the drugs. That's another thing. That's a third act under RICO that had been procured by people under his employ. So legally, from the part of the RICO, you do have the fact that he did commit a lot of these predicate crimes. And because you are seeing a pattern of coercion, this entire RICO is sex trafficking for, and also including the fact that he used his employees to conceal his conduct and protect his reputation. We've seen that over and over and over again from the assistants, from Mia, everybody saying, listen, I wanted to make sure that I would go behind them. I would clean up the hotel rooms to make sure that there was nobody can come back and sell this information. So legally, do I think they're doing a good job? I absolutely do. Now, it only takes one juror to have a hung jury. And we do know that, they have vetted the jury, but there could be somebody on the jury who is, digging in their heels and saying, listen, Sean Combs provided the soundtrack to my college years, and no matter what happens, they're not going to be swayed. So I do think legally, like I said, that they are proving this. And it's important to realize, as I've stated before, just across the river in the Eastern District of New York, R. Kelly was indicted and convicted on very, very similar counts and allegations. Now, there were some instances and allegations of him having, be involved with minors, but there were also a lot of allegations that weren't. So, and then he was brought under a RICO charge as well. So I do think that they have a very good chance of getting a conviction, but again, it all turns on the jurors, and they are going to have the final say.
All right, well, Elizabeth, what's happening next week? What can we expect? Who are we going to hear from? What can you tell us that we can expect in the upcoming weeks?
So Jane is expected to be on the stand for up to a week. She has a scheduling issue, a predetermined, I shouldn't use the word issue, a predetermined scheduling matter that she has to be done with her testimony by Thursday, end of day. So that means that Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, we may have Jane on the stand. Now, the prosecution has said that they will take 2 to 3 full days with her. We're only really at day one, not even, because she's been on the stand for just a matter of hours. And then the prosecution said, we expect that the defense will cross-examine her for the same amount of time. Now, why are they going to take so long with her? Here, based on my reporting on past sex crimes trials with high-profile defendants, what I believe is that there's a lot of gray area. With Mia, it's a bit different, right? She's a former employee. She's not a former romantic partner. It's not as easy. You can't throw the defense on, why did you stay? Why did you continue to engage in these freak-offs, even if you say you were being coerced? But like Cassie, with Jane, the defense is going to say that. It's obvious. That is what they are going to say. They're going to say something along the lines of, he was paying your rent. You said that you told him that you did not want to engage in these hotel nights or so-called freak-offs, but you did anyway. And this is a common theme that we've heard from detractors of the Me Too movement, from defense attorneys who represent these accused men on trial. We heard it in Harvey Weinstein. They say women have agency. You could have walked away. You didn't have to let him pay for your apartment, and you just stayed because of that, right? Now, again, I am paraphrasing what I imagine that the defense is going to say, and I think that is why this is going to take so long. Now, I will note the prosecution already has tried to get ahead of a lot of this, and they've been very effective in showing that this was a complex relationship. But where Lisa says it only takes one juror, it really only does take one. And you may have people who say this absolutely sounds like sex trafficking. He put her through horrific things. But you may have one person who says she could have walked away. Even if what was happening to her is horrific, she could have left. And that is why they brought in that expert witness, Dawn Hughes, to talk about typical behaviors among trauma victims and among sexual assault survivors. They are hoping that Dawn Hughes' testimony sticks in the minds of these jurors so that they understand some of these behaviors and why these alleged victims stay. So that is why this is going to take so long, Carlos. And I also think that's a pretty good summation of, I think, as we near the end of this trial, because remember, Jane is the government's third and final victim. Now, there will be other people to testify, but we are nearing the second half of this. So that is going to be something key in the deliberation room, which essentially is, did these jurors believe that these women were trafficked or not?
It's the end of week 5 of Diddy on trial. The hip-hop mogul has pleaded not guilty to charges including sex trafficking, transportation to engage in prostitution, and racketeering conspiracy. He's facing life in prison. I'm Carlos Greer, senior reporter at Page 6, and I've got questions. Here with the latest on Diddy's court case is entertainment lawyer, former litigator, and legal correspondent Lisa Bonner. How you doing, Lisa?
Hi, Carlos. How are you today?
All good. Let's dive in. I mean, Diddy, he's more than halfway through the trial, and he's fighting for his life. You've been following this trial very closely. What have been the key takeaways from some of the testimonies this week? What stood out to you?
Well, Jane was on the stand for most of the week. We started the week with her cross-examination, and Jane was a very complex witness, as we have seen. The prosecution brought her to the stand to essentially show that there was a pattern of behavior and that Combs sex trafficked her.
Right.
Her testimony was very graphic. She was very detailed. At times she was crying and sniffling and all very much in her feelings, obviously. And so she did give a very straightforward and, like I said, heartfelt and graphic direct examination. However, when the defense brought her to the stand for cross-examination, they were very, let's say, direct in their questioning to basically want to set the stage, this show that Jane was there consensually. And that has been the defense's entire defense throughout this entire trial, that the victims, alleged victims, were there on their own free will. They had consent. They were free to leave whenever they wanted to. And however, each one that we have seen, from Cassie to Mia to Jane, have really shown a very complex relationship, if you will. They all showed allegiance to him. They all professed their love and adoration for Combs. And Mia did the same. And last week or 2 weeks ago, and Jane was really no different. But the defense was very, very defiant and very straightforward about really pushing back and really showing that she was very consensual in these alleged hotel nights. Right. So that was my biggest takeaway. She was a very complex witness.
Okay. And Jane and Mia, they are two alleged victims who are going by the pseudonyms Jane
Correct.
and Mia. So now we know who the three victims are.
Alleged victims.
The alleged victims. So we know who they are. How, now that we've heard from them, how have their testimonies moved? Well, how did Jane's testimony this week, how did it move the needle forward for the prosecution's case?
I've been thinking about this and really trying to analyze it from both parts, right? It's like I said, she gave very effective direct examination by the prosecution. Like I said, the defense was very effective, if I had to choose a word, to really talk about, and so all they need to do is show reasonable doubt in the mind of one juror. So, and her ultimate, motion, if you will, when she left and when Jane got off the stand, she hugged the prosecutor, Maureen Comey, and then went over to hug the defense lawyer. So in this instance, it was very what is happening here? It left a lot of us stunned, because we do know that she had met with the defense lawyers plenty of times before she was called over to be a witness for the prosecution. We also know that Sean Diddy Combs was paying her not only her rent, but for the lawyer that she has used in this trial. So she could have some, mixed feelings and have some type of allegiance. She did say that she loved Combs. So I can't really say about how I feel about her testimony. I don't think it was the strongest. She did seem to at times weaponize, if you will, the hotel nights. When we did see one allegation of when Combs was on vacation with another woman, for example, she said, "Hey, if you come home, I'll do a hotel night for you." But again, what I've talked about before, that the sexual trauma is not always one-dimensional. But I have to say, in the testimony that we saw, juxtaposing, and I'm not making any reference to people's trauma, only the testimony, Cassie's testimony was much more clear in my mind, in terms of the fact that she seemed to be this young, innocent girl at the age of 19, 20, who really turned over her career, her heart, her entire livelihood to Combs, only to have these alleged beatings, these alleged blackmail, and really different efforts to escape, if you will, and was lured back. So her testimony was very strong. Mia, the other, I won't want to call her, she's not victim number two, because they're not alleging that she was sex trafficked. They were just trying to show a pattern of sexual abuse, if you will. She also came across very, very strong for the prosecution. Again, with each one of them had complex relationships, if you will, with Combs. But in terms of I don't want to call it the trauma, but the behavior and the relationship that the two had. So when you look at Jane and how she came across, she was very witty. She clapped back a lot, and she kept trying to say, "You cannot really commercialize, and you can't put a price on my body." So it's going to really come down to, in Jane's instance, whether the jury believes that she was sex trafficked by force, fraud, or coercion, or they really thought that she was in it for the perks and the lifestyle and really was there because she had maybe ulterior motives. We do know that she said that she was not planning to sue Combs, but does she come across as a ex-girlfriend who wanted more and who was there to extract revenge on him because she really never got more? So that's where we are.
Yeah.
I don't really know how I feel about Jane's testimony at this point.
Yeah, and
it's very complex.
Yeah, and the defense is certainly pushing that narrative that these are women who wanted to be with Diddy for the fame, et cetera, et cetera. But you know, there are a lot of stunning moments in this case. Friday, Kanye West, or Ye, if you will, he made an appearance. What was he doing there?
That is a very good question. I mean, you know, it's hard to take anything that Ye does seriously at this point. So I certainly can't offer any legal opinion on it. You know, a lot of times I feel as though he's just there to stir up controversy. I do know that he's been, you know, in Combs' corner and posting, you know, cryptic messages, if you will, on his social media posts, but I really don't know. He was there in and out. He was very brief. He wasn't there for any particular length of time. Mm-hmm. You know, he popped in kind of, you know, Thursday, alluding to the fact, if you will, that he might show up the next day. And he did. He came late and he left very early. So I don't know what he was doing there. I can't even really figure out. I don't try to opine on much Ye does anymore.
But Lisa, I mean, it is Diddy, so it's expected to be a media circus and celebs. But Kanye, he's a mega star and he's extremely polarizing. So, you know, how does having someone like Kanye in the courtroom, how does that affect the jury and their opinion of Diddy?
Well, he was not in the courtroom. He was in the overflow room. So the jury probably did not know that he was there. Remember, they're not supposed to be looking at any kind of news coverage about it or engaging on any type of social media. So they might not have even known that he was present. And the court, you know, is very, it's not as much as a media circus. I was there yesterday. It was not, there weren't very many protesters or free Diddy people. There weren't very many people out there outside the courthouse at all, except for, you know, the smattering of news, the news tents and things. But it has calmed down quite a bit.
And so you're not seeing tons of fans or pro Diddy or anti Diddy people out there. What I mean, you just said it, but what was that scene like for you yesterday when you were outside of the courthouse?
I was there with another news outlet, and we, you know, it was much less of a media spectacle than I had anticipated. There were, like I said, there weren't very many protesters. They had about maybe 6 or 7 different tents that were there that were broadcasting or filming, you know, updates across from the entrance to the court, where people go in and out. And that was it. If you might not, it was very underwhelming from maybe, I think people have gone in and, you know, people have gone down and now they're just like, yeah. So it was very underwhelming.
Yeah, it wasn't the Diddy circus that you would expect. Got it.
So I think after 5 or 6, you know, going into the 6th week of testimony, you know, people have really
it's died down.
Yeah.
Well, you know, I asked you this last week, and of course, I know that, you know, it's up to the jury. But, you know, there's only a few more weeks left. So based on the testimonies from these past 5 weeks, in your legal opinion, what are the chances that Diddy will walk free?
Well, let me just be clear. Again, we talked about it's up to the jury, and it's going to come down to closing arguments and, you know, the jury instructions and things of that sort. However, just as we saw in the in Harvey Weinstein's verdict a few days ago, if you will, there is a very big possibility that he could have a split verdict. For example, Diddy could be found guilty, for example, just me opining on the 2 counts of transportation for the purposes of prostitution. They've pretty much clearly proven that Diddy had engaged and brought prostitutes across state lines for the purposes of commercial sex acts. And that's really clear in the statute. So he could be found guilty of that. He could be found, for example, guilty of what we talked about, Jane versus Cassie's testimony. He also could be found guilty of maybe one count of sex trafficking, just maybe one. So it's so hard to really get into the juror's mind, right? And if you're not there all day, every day, we're not hearing the voluminous amount of testimony, if you will, that each juror is hearing all day, every day. And it's important to remember that we don't know who are the alternates and who are the jurors that are going to be deliberating. And so it's 18 people in there, and it's going to come down to 12 of those 18 in the jury room. And like we saw in Harvey Weinstein's trial, people have very strong opinions. And the reason I say it's going to come down to the jury instructions and the law is because what the judge gives, the defense and the prosecution work together. And I'm sure that they've been doing this already. And it's a very long and tedious and arduous process about really giving these instructions to the jury about what they are to consider in each count. And then you take that and they break it down and they break out what the New York statute is for each of these alleged crimes. So it is very possible, like I said, that the jurors could argue over whether or not that they thought consent was given in either one of these sex trafficking counts. They could also look and talk about the RICO charge, for example. Now, if we talk about RICO, the underlying, not the predicate crimes, but the underlying crime that they are alleging in the actual RICO charge is the sex trafficking. So they are saying that Combs used his commercial and human resources of his company to further his desires, protect and conceal his conduct and his reputation in furtherance of the sex trafficking. So that's what it basically comes down to. And through the RICO charge, as we've talked about before, you need to show only 2 predicate crimes. And we have talked about that they have shown very many of these. Some are circumstantial, but we do have direct evidence of the possession of narcotics with the intent to distribute. We have direct evidence of the fact that there are weapons charges. And today on Friday, there was a special agent on the stand that talked about, again, the raid of his Los Angeles home and really discussed about how the arsenal of weapons that were there. Again, we saw this in Miami. We saw the arsenal of weapons that were alleged to be found in his home in Los Angeles, with magazines, AR-15, shotguns, rifles, some with scrubbed off serial numbers. So again, that is direct evidence of the weapons charges. So the predicate crimes, we only need 2, and then you have to again look at the sex trafficking allegations. Was there a pattern of behavior from Combs and his people that worked for him to carry out these hotel nights, these freak-offs? And were these consensual, or were these women brought in to engage in hotel nights and freak-offs by force, fraud, or coercion?
Okay, so what should we pay attention to next week?
I'm very interested to see, I think next week might be the last week of direct testimony. So I'm very interested to see who the prosecution is going to bring on. And I think we talked about this here before, Carlos. We've heard about Christina Karam and her testimony for the past 5 to 6 weeks. Very many witnesses have talked about their direct involvement with Christina Karam, who is Diddy's former chief of staff. It is also important to understand that a lot of the evidence that has come in from Christina Karam's phone, which was obtained by the prosecutors in March of 2024 at an airport. So it's, a lot of this direct testimony that we're getting from these witnesses have referenced Christina Karam and also the security guard D-Rock. Now, do we need them to come in? I would say they have done a very good job of proving this, that they have direct testimony from Christina Karam. But I'm here to tell you, as after sitting through 6 weeks and really listening to and reading and keeping up with this trial bit by bit, piece by piece, I think the prosecution's case would fall a bit flat if we don't have Christina Karam to be brought to the stand. Now, if the prosecution doesn't bring her, the defense might, which is why I'm saying the prosecution needs to get ahead of this, offer her an immunity deal, because there have been some serious allegations where she has been alleged to have been involved with a lot of the procurement of drugs, the covering up of evidence, of trying to obtain copies of the sex tape from the Hotel Intercontinental. So there's been a lot of testimony repeatedly from each witness that has come forward and talked about Christina Karam, or KK. So if they do not bring her to the stand, I am really going to feel like that it's falling flat, because you do need the big summation of her testimony to really show not only did he have his assistants, his underlings, if you will, but he also had lieutenants, people that worked very closely with him, not under their direction, but with him. And we do seem to have Christina Karam was the most prevalent witness who has been alleged to have been participating in a lot of these underlying crimes. And also, I would love to see the prosecution bring D-Rock, his security guard, to the stand as well.
It was a shortened week for the Sean Diddy Combs trial, but that certainly doesn't mean there was less drama. Sick jurors, dismissed jurors, Diddy's alleged drug mule took the stand, explicit text messages, and jurors saw clips of the rap mogul's freak-off videos. I'm Carlos Greer, senior reporter for Page 6, and I've got questions. Entertainment lawyer, former litigator, and legal correspondent Lisa Bonner is back to fill us in on what happened in week 6 of the Diddy trial. Lisa, happy belated Juneteenth. How you doing?
Thank you, Carlos. Happy Juneteenth to you. It's all month as far as I'm concerned.
Well, so court was, of course, out on Thursday observing the holiday, but court was also abruptly canceled on Wednesday due to a juror calling out sick. What happened, and how does this affect the scheduling of this trial?
Well, the juror called in sick. We don't know much about it other than this juror, male or woman, was phoned in to have symptoms of vertigo by his or her partner. So because all jurors need to be present and accounted for the testimony, they had to cancel court on Wednesday. And of course, as we just discussed yesterday, was Juneteenth, a federal holiday. So the court did not have a session yesterday.
All right. And, the week actually kicked off with some juror drama. Juror number 6 was dismissed. What can you tell us about that, Lisa?
Juror number 6 was dismissed earlier in the week because there was some issue over where he lived. Initially, when he came in for jury voir dire, he stated that he lived in the Bronx. And the Southern District of New York covers the entire area from Manhattan to the Bronx up to the counties, Westchester County, up into Poughkeepsie. And so those jurors must be pulled from that particular area. When he took the oath and took the voir dire, and then followed by the oath, he stated that he was living in the Bronx. But it came out through another conversation with someone in the court, just through conversation about where he lived. And there was some issue there that he actually was living in New Jersey with his girlfriend and his baby's mother. So there was some back and forth over that. And the judge basically took the weekend, as we talked about last Friday, stating that he was going to think about it over the weekend, but he was inclined to dismiss juror number 6 because he did not meet the definition of a juror who was pulled from the SDNY district. So the defense vehemently objected to this dismissal because the juror who was dismissed was a 90s hip hop fan and was also a Black and Latino male. So there was some issue about being judged by a jury of your peers. And obviously you want someone who is referenced and akin to your racial makeup and your leanings of what you do for a living in terms of being a hip hop head. So in terms of that, the defense pushed back and said, this is shrinking. This is one of the very few Black men on the jury. So it's affecting our ability to get a fair trial. The only issue with that argument is that when you have voir dire, each side is given a certain number of preemptive challenges where they can dismiss a juror for any reason or no reason whatsoever other than a prohibited reason, which is a reason based on sex, gender, or ethnicity. So because of that did not meet the qualifications of being affecting him in terms of one who might be able to stay on the jury. This is a well-known Supreme Court case. So while the defense did have somewhat of a rational reason, it did not meet a legal reason. And so therefore the judge went ahead and dismissed juror number 6 because he did not live in the particular district for the SCNY.
Okay, let's talk about what happened in the courtroom this week. So a huge moment is that jurors got a literal glimpse at what Combs' freak-offs look like. They watched the videos, and the freak-offs are crucial to this case. But what exactly are they proving? Because the defense, they're arguing that these encounters are consensual and not crimes.
That's, Carlos, as the case has gone on, I've been really trying to figure out what the prosecution's MO is here. And by showing the alleged freak-offs, again, we don't know, nobody except for the jury knows exactly what were on those freak-off tapes, right? And the hotel nights, we don't know. So we are really just playing a guessing game in terms of whether we, think it was showing Combs in alleged, abusive behavior. We just don't know. There was no sound, there was no video shown to the jury, anyone outside of the jury. So what we do know is that there was some evidence of the freak-offs shown. And so the tapes were very graphic. We understand that there were jurors who were wincing, some jurors kind of turned away. So we're, kind of left to really try and figure out and interpret what the jury was thinking with those particular tapes, again, which we don't know what was on them. But the prosecution, again, is trying to show sex trafficking by force, fraud, or coercion. Therefore, I would assume that some of the tapes really did show maybe Jane or a victim number 2, Jane, who's going under the pseudonym Jane, or Cassie, in some uncomfortable positions, maybe having difficult dialogue with Combs about whether or not they wanted to continue with this particular sexual act. I don't know, but we do know that the prosecution's entire case is built around the force, fraud, or coercion, and also that Combs did hire some prostitutes and flew them or made arrangements for them to cross state lines. And so that is another charge in the indictment. Transportation for the purposes of prostitution.
Because you mentioned, so victim number 2, just so I'm clear, because victim number 2 is that with the pseudonyms, it can get a little confusing. So victim number 3 is Jane, who goes by
victim number 2.
Victim number 2 is Jane. Okay, so victim number 2 is Jane, and then there was also another pseudonym. Mia who
was an assistant who worked for Combs. And although not a victim, again, they were trying to show, forcible acts, violence, sexual assault with Mia. With Jane, who was an ex-girlfriend, who is victim number 2, who is alleged to be victim number 2 in the indictment, that is the one that we were just speaking of in terms of all of them were alleged on the hotel nights and in the freak-offs. I'm assuming that they were showing something that lent itself to the prosecution's argument of it being the sexual acts being under duress, force, fraud, or coercion. So some type of control, if you will, that Sean was exerting over Cassie and Jane.
So his assistant, Diddy's assistant, Brendan Paul, the alleged drug mule, he took the stand this week, and he was arrested, as you know, he was arrested last year for cocaine possession. What did we learn from his testimony? What was your takeaway?
My takeaway was that he was anything but a drug mule. Again, I'm starting to question some of the prosecution's witnesses because they are coming in and falling a little flat. We do know that that Brendan was arrested last year at Miami airport upon landing, and they were about to take off for a family trip, if you will, with Sean and his personal, chief of staff, Christina Karam. And when he was arrested, he had some cocaine on him, and he testified that this cocaine was something that he had picked up in a sweep of the hotel rooms from one of the king nights or the hotel nights, and that he threw it in his bag. He forgot about it. And the defense honed in on that and stated, hey, you weren't asked by Christina Karam or Diddy to transport these drugs. And he said, no, I was not. And I, basically threw it in my bag and forgot. So I was basically caught off guard when I realized that there was that cocaine in my bag because it was a mistake. And then the defense went even further and asked him, do you really would you consider yourself a drug mule for Sean Combs? And he said, absolutely not. And so he was anything but. And his lawyer chimed in and said, now that we've heard this testimony, we would hope that all of the speculation and all of the defamatory remarks that have been made about my client would cease. So that was a very underwhelming testimony for the prosecution side. I'm starting to think that they maybe should have rested a while ago because, a lot of these people that they're calling in my opinion, are falling flat. And we can talk about that in a little bit.
Well, we've talked about Christina Karam, Diddy's chief of staff here. She's definitely all over the courtroom, but she's not there. She hasn't taken the stand. So, we've heard about her text messages. So like I said, she's definitely in the courtroom, but not physically. Are you surprised she didn't take the stand? And does her not taking the stand hurt the prosecution?
Carlos, surprised is not even the correct word. I am literally blown away. And again, in talking about the case falling flat, meaning that the prosecution basically stated, and expressly stated in one or more times that Christina Karam was an unindicted co-conspirator. So, when you're asking the everyday person to think about what RICO entails, RICO is generally a conspiracy of people, right? And so we've always talked about,
the Combs enterprise.
Right, having a conspiracy of one. And so how odd that is, and the fact that no one else has been indicted in quote unquote turn state's evidence. And so for Christina to have been mentioned, for the security guard, D-Rock, to have been mentioned several times over, and neither one of them have been brought to the stand. What you have now is him directing a bunch of underlings. And we do know from the facts of the text messages and the digital footprint, the messages extracted from KK's phone, if you will, that she was directly involved in a lot of this, but not to bring her in, it doesn't close the loop for me. I mean, we don't need her, but it just doesn't sit the same, if that makes any sense to you.
Well, I mean, with that in mind, because it definitely sounds like, your mind about this case has changed a bit from over the weeks that we've been talking. Who would you say has the upper hand right now?
Well, again, let's be clear that there are 5 charges under the indictment. There is one RICO charge, which includes sex trafficking by force, fraud, or coercion through his employees, by his assistants and people of Combs Enterprises, protecting his conduct, protecting his reputation, concealing his conduct, and furthering his conduct. So that's one charge. And he has 2 counts of sex trafficking by force, fraud, or coercion. That is Cassie, and victim number 2, Jane. And there are 2 counts of transportation for the purposes of prostitution. So I don't want to say that there is a very good possibility of a split verdict, in my opinion. I do think that they, without equivocation, have proven the allegations of transportation for the purposes of prostitution. We've seen Diddy's, the text messages, we've seen the emails, we've heard from different assistants how he set up and interacted with these prostitutes and cowboys and angels and all of these different agencies. So we do have proof of that. So that is, 1 or 2 counts. Sex trafficking by force, fraud, or coercion, I think that could also be a split verdict if we look at it, through the lens of the indictment, if you will. I do believe that if you believe if you believe her testimony, that she could not leave without fear of retribution or retaliation, there's a very good chance that he could get convicted on that. I think Jane is falling a little bit flat. She also almost came across at the end as not a bitter ex-girlfriend, but someone who really did, although they all did have feelings for Combs, she came across as if he had treated her a little bit differently, more of a girlfriend, perhaps. Maybe we wouldn't be in this situation. So I'm not really sure that really lends itself to any kind of guilty charge on that. Now, let's go to RICO. That's what we've just talked about, right? That we have some missing, not crucial elements, but people I would have liked to have seen. Christina Karam, I would have liked to see in D-Rock. But if you do believe that Cassie was sex trafficked pursuant to the statute by force, fraud, or coercion, and that he used people in his staff and his commercial resources from the company to further that, which they have done, and they have issues of underlying predicate crimes, which we've talked about before, right? Which we have direct evidence of fraud, obstruction of justice, weapons possession. We have direct evidence of possession of drugs with the intent to distribute. Again, remember that does not have to be through a commercial purpose. He does not have to be selling them. He's given them out to people. Frank Black, we've seen that. So we've seen a lot in terms of the predicate crimes that fall under RICO. The problem is that the everyday person might be looking for a little bit more in terms of people in that enterprise to have compelled and cooperated with him, as opposed to people under his employ, if you will, right? So you have the co-conspirators for people who are more or less on his, with him, working with him, not under him. And so that's where I think Christina, Karam, and D-Rock would have been super helpful. Now, let me say this. I do believe that a lot of this is going to fall on the closing arguments of each party. And it is going to it's going to be really taking a look at what those jury instructions are, because those, as we do know, are going to be very crucial, because you have to go by what you have heard and what is in those jury instructions, which include the statutes of sex trafficking, of RICO, of transportation for the purposes of prostitution. So we've seen all that. So I say all that to say it's going to be a mixed bag, and it's going to come down to next week. I think it's going to be very crucial for both sides.
Yeah. Well, I mean, prosecution is wrapping up. So what can we expect next week? What can we expect from the defense next week?
The defense said that their case might be 1 or 2 days tops. And remember, as we've talked about before in this series, Carlos, when you asked me who they could bring to the stand, I don't know. I really don't know who they could bring to the stand. So it could be just their closing argument. I would not be surprised about that. Because remember, the defense does not have to put on a case. The burden is on the prosecution to prove beyond a reasonable doubt each element in the count according to the jury instructions in the statute. So they don't have to put on anything. They could just get up and give their summation on Tuesday or Wednesday, and that would be that. That is what I think. I do not know who they could bring that could lead any kind of credibility, credence, especially in light of the fact that they don't have to put on a case. So I suspect nobody.
Final thoughts on how the prosecution fought their case?
If they could have wrapped after Mia, one or two, more persons after Mia. I think we could have had a 4-week direct case, meaning a case from the prosecution, 4 to 5 weeks. We did not need to go this extra, week and a half. Jane, certainly, as we've talked about, didn't do much, but you do need to show a pattern. So I understand what they were trying to do, but it just did not work out. So, the elements are there, certainly for a conviction on mostly everything in my legal opinion. But again, it's going to come down to the jury instructions, the closing arguments, and it did not flesh out. It started really strong, and it just kind of fell flat. It didn't, crash and burn by any stretch of the imagination, but there was no real trajectory, let's say, after Mia. Brianna Bongolan, there was contemporaneous evidence by Cassie that she was dangled off the balcony, but then there were some issues of, what was the date? And so she didn't really do much to move the needle. So it just kind of started to just be a mediocre case at that. So they really could have stopped after Mia and just maybe brought 1 or 2 more summary witnesses, which I think are important. We didn't talk about that this week, Carlos. So let me just get a quick word in about the summary witnesses. What they are tasked to do, I talked about the jury instructions, right? And how important that is. So what the summary witnesses are to do is to bring in and summarize all of the voluminous data that they have talked about over the course of this case. So as opposed to really looking in the juror's notebook and trying to see, in this date they said that, you could actually have you could flip to page 3, exhibit A to hear and look at, whatever evidence there was from that particular date. So the summary witnesses are very important. So that was something that I thought that the prosecution was necessary, and they did that well. But again, that is something I believe that they could have done a couple weeks ago. But we'll see. We'll probably be talking about this by next week. By next Friday, we're going to have some more insight.
The bombshell Manhattan trial of U.S. versus Diddy is nearing the finish line. It's the end of week 7. The prosecution and defense gave closing arguments, and I've got questions. And if you've been tuning in every week, then you know who's here. Entertainment lawyer, former litigator, and legal correspondent Lisa Bonner. Now, Lisa, we're just going to dive in because you were texting and DMing me last night, and you didn't see this coming. What surprised you about the closing arguments and jury instructions?
Well, we have not gotten to jury instructions, but let me lead into that with the closing arguments. We have heard about a pattern of behavior from Combs, and that the prosecution is alleging. They have alleged this pattern of sex trafficking, this pattern of abuse, this pattern of every crime that he has really been alleged. And what surprised me is that when the prosecution started their closing argument, and as they built up into their closing argument, they kept repeating the fact that the sex in the freak-offs and the hotel nights, you only had to show one instance of sex trafficking by force, fraud, or coercion. And that is under the law, that is the statute and the case law that they had cited. But the interesting thing is they switched from the pattern to just really hammer it home to the jury. So I think from a purpose of, I believe, maybe looking at their rationale for this, is they wanted to show that this is a really horrible person who has committed this act with the freak-off, this act with the freak-off, and just kept talking about the freak-offs and the hotel nights, only to dial it back and say, you know what, you only need to find one instance. And that could be, with Cassie, that could be the Intercontinental, where if you look at it, she was trying to escape the freak off. That has been admitted into evidence as fact. So that is one of the things that was very interesting to me. Now, the reason I think they did it was to simplify it, because it's easy to find one count as opposed to looking at the totality of the circumstances, perhaps, and trying to really figure out, was it more likely than not that she wanted to stay? And sometimes she did, sometimes she didn't. Nope. They narrowed that down and said, you need only one time to talk about and find him guilty of sex trafficking. A huge moment in shift and in simplicity.
Mm-hmm. So essentially they were saying all those other moments when, with the text messages, if it appeared that she was agreeing and wanting, these freak offs with Diddy, they were saying that's inconsequential, just so I'm clear. It only needs to be this one instance.
The one instance. And that, I think, is what shocked everybody, because they've been showing this pattern. They admitted over 2,000 text messages and emails into evidence. So just think about how the average jury thinks of RICO, and they always think of it as this complicated enterprise with co-conspirators, and we could talk about that in a bit. But in the underlying crime that they had used in the RICO and cited in the RICO was sex trafficking by force, fraud, or coercion. So that they said, you know what? You don't need a pattern. You only need to find one instance for Jane, and you only need to find one instance for Cassie. Now, remember, you need predicate crimes under RICO. And they emphasize that you only need two, which I have been talking about with you. The fact that you need two, whether it's forced labor, embezzlement from Cassie's mother, fraud or bribery with the security guard in purchasing the tape, obstruction of justice in terms of purchasing the tape. So they went on and really simplified it. Drugs, the possession of narcotics with the intent to distribute, weapons charges. So they walked through every underlying predicate crime that they had been alleged, including kidnapping and arson, but those are a little bit more circumstantial, in my opinion, for the jury to look at. But they simplified this in a way that really makes it digestible, if you will, for the average juror.
Right. So with that in mind, so for several weeks, I think it's accurate to say that the prosecution did an effective job painting Diddy as this terrifying, monstrous tycoon. In fact, during their closing argument, U.S. Attorney Christy Slavin, this is what she said. She said, he thought that his fame, wealth, and power put him above the law. But over the course of this trial, his crimes have been exposed. So how effective were they proving that he is, in fact, a criminal?
That's what we've talked about this on a going backwards basis, right? Since the very beginning. They have really honed in on the fact that Sean Combs is one who is in charge of everything, that people exist in fear, but they also love him for whatever reason, and he takes advantage of that. That has been their narrative, that through each witness, through each alleged victim, they have all talked about that pattern of abuse, whether it's through forced labor with the assistants, in terms of making them work toward 90 hours in some instances, where they have literally passed out and had to go to get rehydrated, or each assistant has alleged mostly forced labor. So they have gone through and they have really talked about what a not nice person that he is. And as one of the assistants stated, this was Diddy's kingdom, and we were all there to serve him. And that is what the prosecution really focused on throughout this trial, basically saying that he was this person who wielded power over his assistants, over his girlfriends for his own pleasure, and used his unindicted co-conspirators, Christina Karam and D-Rock, to help further that criminal enterprise, as well as using commercial resources from Combs' enterprise in furtherance thereof.
Right. So the defense, they gave their closing arguments today. So what was their rebuttal? What did they argue?
They argued that that they had Cassie and Cassie and Diddy and Cassie and Jane had a swingers lifestyle. They owned the domestic violence. They said that he was a pillar of the community in terms of working with him. He embraced and started DEI before it was a thing. So they talked about a lot of his personality in terms of the business world and said, he had legitimate businesses. And what he did amounted to his personal life. For instance, they were talking about the freak offs, and that was his personal life. They were talking about the fact that he used drugs, and that was his personal life. And he was not distributing drugs for commercial purposes. But some of that, what they are talking about, is not in fact what is in the law. For example, with the possession of drugs with the intent to distribute, it does not need to be for commercial purposes. It could be you are taking these GHB or a Molly or whatever drugs that they had talked, or ketamine, and you're giving it to people. The possession of those types of drugs, especially as Frank Black under a pseudonym, is illegal. And then you're distributing these illegal drugs to people. That is illegal. And that does rise to the letter of the law of possession of drugs, of narcotics with the intent to distribute. So while this defense did try to do a good job in terms of humanizing him to the best of their ability, a lot of what they said is going to need curative instruction. In fact, that they did get some curative instruction from the judge, meaning that the judge had to correct what the defense said to the jury. And so it was what we thought it was. It was consensual. It was swingers lifestyle. He was a good guy. If he was going to do anything to Kid Cudi, he would have fought him with his two hands. There's no evidence of Diddy ever fighting anybody. So anyway, it was the best they could do and with what they had, I thought.
All right, so Lisa, I thought it was interesting that defense attorney Mark Agnifilo, he argued that Cassie is just like Diddy and they matched each other's energy. And he even called her a gangster. And like you said, they acknowledged the domestic violence, but he described their relationship as a great modern love story. What did you make of that? And how do you think that's going to play out with the jury?
That flies into every face of reason that one could think of. And basically what he was saying is that even though they had this toxic relationship, they loved each other. She did not want to leave. She never said that she wanted to leave, when in fact she did. And that is admitted into evidence that she tried to get away. He did certain things to lure her back, whether it was attempting to exploit and offering to exploit these freak off videos, or extorting money from her mother, or dragging her physically back. That is not a modern day love story. Every woman and every man knows that that is not the type of behavior that two loving, consensual adults have. Also, that undermines the fact of the manner of consent. It is a well-known fact of law that a husband can be guilty of raping his wife if there is not consent in the relationship. And we talked about this from the beginning, Carlos. Every single act of sexual relations between two people needs consent, period. So that is not a normal relationship by any stretch of the imagination. And like I said before, they were grasping at straws and basically stating that she played Kid Cudi as well. And, that is so immaterial to what is supposed to be about the law.
So, of course, Diddy, he pled not guilty. In what world does he walk free?
That's a tough question. And let me just say this. In any world, we know better as lawyers to try and predict what a jury would do. From a legal perspective, I can only offer my opinion, but I do believe that he would be convicted at minimal on the transportation for the purposes of prostitution. Those 2 counts is very straightforward. Only thing you have to show is that you paid for a commercial sex worker to come across state lines and have sex with you. So that is very well established. In terms of the sex trafficking counts, I would say that when the prosecution simplified the case so well and stated that you only need 1 act, that is how, when you're going, just let me back up, when you're going through 7 weeks of testimony showing how horrible one person is and establishing a pattern, and then your gotcha moment to the jury is, okay, whatever, with anything that you think about the sex trafficking, you only need 1. And that is what is going to be in the jury instructions, along with the law, which talks about this through force, fraud, or coercion. So when you're looking at it through a reasonable person standard from someone who has been in that courtroom for 7 weeks, I would think that there is not a realistic chance that Diddy walks. I don't think so. And also, let me point out, and I've said this before, Carlos, but I want to point out also that R. Kelly was convicted of 9 counts of sex trafficking as a 1-man RICO case. Now, again, some of those were minors and many of them weren't. However, he did not have any named co-conspirators, just like Diddy didn't. And he was convicted in the Eastern District of New York, literally right across the water, of the same type of case.
All right, Lisa, what happens next week?
Well, they're going to get jury instructions on Monday, and that is going to take up, I would say, at least half of the day, because from what I understand, there are about 50 pages of jury instructions, and then they're going to get a ballot, a ballot form, essentially. And so the judge will go and explain the jury instructions to them. He's going to give them the weekend to talk about and marinate on everything they've heard. And so Monday they will start with the jury charge and the jury instructions and the form, and then they will begin deliberations, and we shall see.
Well, Lisa, thank you for joining me every week to connect the dots in Diddy. I will see you next week. I know you're going on vacation after
I'm
all
going
of
on
this.
vacation, and I do believe that the next time we speak, by next Friday, I do believe that we will have a verdict.
Right. Lisa predicts a verdict. All right, to stay up to date with all things Diddy trial, including a possible verdict next week, visit us at page6.com and watch us on YouTube.